Now, Congressman Darrell Issa was a phenomenally successful businessman in his own right, turning a small computer company into a multi-million-dollar enterprise. Congressman Issa's in New York today, and I spoke to him just moments ago. Congressman Darrell Issa here in New York. Great to see you. Thank you for being here. Appreciate
Well, it's good to be in what used to be the center of the financial world.
New York is no longer the center?
It's moved to Washington. It's where corporations seem to be owned.
What is happening, and how do we change it?
Well, the first thing we need to do is we need to get corporate America to say enough is enough. One of the problems, David, is that corporate America, once they get the big ship, they don't seem to pay attention to the small boats that feed them, that are their tenders, and that ultimately create the next big ships. This is part of the relationship with government we see in Washington is big corporations say, how do we compromise? Well, little corporations say, we'll never get to be big if you compromise.
Now, Milton Friedman used to say the biggest enemy of capitalism is not the socialist, but the businessman who wants a free market for everybody except himself. Was he right?
He was absolutely right. Look, I was a chamber member as a small businessman, but when I came to Washington, what I discovered was that the NFIB, the small independent business representatives, exist because sometimes the big chamber is too enamored with big government and cutting a deal and not really interested enough in the problem. You know, healthcare reform, big discussion. Small business has a problem which isn't being fixed in most of these proposals coming out of Washington.
But small business is representing millions of small Americans out there who are pushing back. And the politicians are, in my mind anyway, seem to be getting the message that they can't continue on this track much longer.
Well, I don't think they're getting the message. I think they got the message in August. I think they're rewriting the message, doing the same thing, but pretending that it's no longer August, and somehow there's a kinder, gentler trillion-dollar healthcare takeover. Cap and trade is still out there. It's still going to come back. And in fact, a whole set of social agenda that are not making us more competitive, not dealing with the fact that the rest of the world is getting more competitive. You know, and ultimately, the problem for the large businesses is how do they get enough overseas operations so they make revenue over there. But if you're an American company, and this is where you do tool and die work, you're dying. And you're dying because we're no longer concentrating on America being competitive.
And cap and trade is one of those perfect issues that the big companies, they can eat up a lot of the expenses, but the small and mid-sized companies, the ones that are energy intensive, they won't be able to afford it. A lot of them are going to die if it's put into place.
If it's American jobs, you're going to have a hard time competing. If you can move your jobs to other parts of the world, your corporation, including General Electric and all the big ones, they'll do okay. But the question is, are they employing Americans or simply an American corporation who, quite frankly, could change their flag at some time in the future?
Now, famously, Maggie Thatcher said the problem with socialism, eventually you run out of other people's money. That's going to happen sooner than later, isn't it? And won't that make us change our ways?
Well, unfortunately, Margaret Thatcher was talking about money. And in our case, we're talking about credit. We already ran out of money. Now our problem is, how long will the credit last? Well,
how long will people continue to buy our credit?
You know, the Chinese will continue to enable us until the last industrial part of our empire is gone, because they're benefiting every time a job moves to China, even if it's on credit, and ultimately those jobs can't come back. David, I came from the electronics industry. I got to a point in electronics where the components, not one of them was made in America. So you could assemble in America, but you were assembling it with all offshore parts. We have lost and continue to lose industry. Protectionism won't work, but losing our competitiveness won't work either. We have to choose. Are we going to close our doors and try to start making everything again? I don't think so. But are we going to do the things we need to do to be competitive? Right now, we're not heading that way.
You're making me depressed, because I had thought that we had begun to see the pushback, that we had begun to see a change in America where the people were stopping them on the public option, they were stopping them on cap and trade, at least in the Senate, and that perhaps some of that spirit could be translated into policy, some of that capitalist spirit. But it sounds like you're writing the death knell for capitalism.
Well, the next election, I think, think, is going to make a huge shift. And I think people, whether they're in the Republican Party or the Democratic Party, if they're for big government and for these big government programs, I think they're going to face the voters with a huge disadvantage in their reelect. But having said that, there's a push toward getting it done now so that it can't easily be undone, certainly not during this presidency. That's the problem we have, is you can't undo what we do this year with an election.
Don't politicians care more about getting reelected than they do about this agenda?
I would hope they do, but quite frankly, you have enough members of the House and Senate who feel safe enough that if they get this done and put it behind them, they think they're better off than if it fails to get done. And David, if you think about 1994, they took up health care, it became unpopular, they dropped it. I believe that Democratic leadership right now has decided that if they drop it now, they lose, so they might as well make it happen, and they might win. But of course, America will lose if we go down $1 trillion wrong direction, and the American worker becomes less competitive, which is what's happening.
Well, you have a significant voice. You're a member of the Committee on Oversight and Government Reform. You're getting a lot of attention for going after the potential of corruption in Congress and other factors that people care a lot about. Do you think your voice is being more easily heard by Americans, and will it have an impact on policy?
Well, David, it's the reason that even though my committee works on waste, fraud, and abuse in government, that I'm weighing in as a former businessman, because I know the direction we're going is going to make us less competitive. It's going to cost jobs. And I think every American out there understands that government can hire you, but only the private sector can create a real job. We're not creating jobs. Government jobs through the stimulus are keeping people from being laid off, while at the same time, new job growth is being stifled, and real investment into America. And I'm not talking about buying our products and loaning the money back to us, but real investment in America is at a low, and it's continuing to be at a low. You know, one of the things that used to get me was when we'd see the efficiency that we were being rated on, and they'd say productivity increase, and then they'd say, well, but actually Congress and other factors that people care a lot about. Do you think your voice is being more easily heard by Americans, and will it have an impact on policy? Well, David, it's the reason that even though my committee works on waste, fraud, and abuse in government, that I'm weighing in as a former businessman, because I know the direction we're going is going to make us less competitive. It's going to cost jobs. And I think every American out there understands that government can hire you, but only the private sector can create a real job. We're not creating jobs. Government jobs through the stimulus are keeping people from being laid off, while at the same time, new job growth is being stifled, and real investment into America. And I'm not talking about buying our products and loaning the money back to us, but real investment in America is at a low, and it's continuing to be at a low. You know, one of the things that used to get me was when we'd see the efficiency that we were being rated on, and they'd say productivity increase, and then they'd say, well, but actually if you shut down a factory here and move the labor off and buy the part cheaper, then the final product is more competitive. And I looked at the time and said, wait a second, if you score that way, then if you can get the goods for less with no U.S. manufacturing, you're going to be really competitive, and that's going to be high productivity. We've got to score productivity based on American jobs that create more with American labor.
You were extremely successful because you pulled yourself up with your bootstraps, by your bootstraps. You started from scratch. You built a company worth $100 million or more. Could you have done the same if you were starting right now?
The tax rates during the Reagan administration and the incentives were very favorable for me. And they're not that much less favorable right now, but they're heading in the wrong direction, and they're heading very quickly. I will tell you one thing. My home state of California has made it almost impossible for anyone to do what I did back in the mid-'80s, which was to move from Cleveland, where I was born and raised, to California.
Now they're moving to Texas.
Absolutely. I'd moved to Texas, Tennessee, North and South Carolina. I could not, in good conscience, suggest moving to a place where you have a 10% penalty for being successful.
Despite all this is a final question. Are you optimistic?
I am, because I think the American people are on the right side, and it's just a question of whether they get a vote before we vote.
Darrell, Issa, great to see you.